The mountains of Helmand Province stretched endlessly under the star-filled Afghan sky, their jagged peaks hiding secrets worth dying for. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez lay prone on the rocky outcrop, her M4 carbine beside her, studying the Taliban compound through her night vision scope. The green-tinted world revealed a fortress carved into the mountainside, 3 levels of reinforced stone and concrete that intelligence claimed held the location of 3 high-value targets planning coordinated attacks on American soil. Medic 6, you copy? The voice crackled through her earpiece. Chief Petty Officer David Kim, SEAL Team 6's lead breacher, was somewhere in the darkness 200 meters ahead, invisible even to her trained eyes. Copy, Chief. Medical station established. Trauma bay ready, Rodriguez whispered back, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid mountain air. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who'd performed battlefield medicine under the worst possible conditions. At 28, she'd already earned a reputation as the medic who could work miracles under fire, a reputation forged through 73 combat missions across 2 brutal Afghan deployments. The compound below wasn't just any Taliban stronghold. This was the nerve center of what Central Command called the Network, a sophisticated cell responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. For 6 months, intelligence analysts had tracked communications flowing from this mountain fortress to bomb makers in Kandahar, weapons smugglers along the Pakistani border, and sleeper cells in Kabul. Tonight's Joint Ranger SEAL operation, designated Operation Nightfall, would either capture or eliminate the cell's leadership before they could execute their planned offensive against coalition forces. Rodriguez shifted her position slightly, checking her gear one final time. Her medical kit was spread in a precise semicircle around her position, every piece of equipment positioned for lightning-fast access in complete darkness. Hemostatic gauze arranged by size and type, 4 tourniquets within immediate reach of either hand, chest seals organized by application method. Her aid bag contained enough supplies to treat 12 major trauma cases, each item selected based on hard-won experience about what actually saved lives when the shooting started. She'd handpicked every piece of equipment based on lessons learned the hard way. The quick clot bandages that had stopped arterial bleeding during the Marja offensive. The emergency cricothyrotomy kit that had saved a ranger's life when shrapnel crushed his larynx. The morphine auto-injectors that had kept wounded soldiers functional long enough to reach evacuation helicopters. Every zipper, every pocket, every piece of medical gear represented lives saved and lessons learned in blood. All elements, this is actual, came the voice of Major Thompson, the Ranger Company commander leading tonight's operation. 15 minutes to a hour. Weather station reports, winds shifting to the southeast at 8 knots. Cloud cover moving in from the west. All teams report status over. Rodriguez listened as each element checked in through her earpiece. Alpha. Team the SEAL assault element positioned at the compound's main entrance, ready to breach and clear the primary target building. Bravo Team Rangers establishing a blocking position on the northern ridge to prevent escape through the mountain. Passes. Charlie Team Sniper overwatch from elevated positions with clear fields of fire across the compound. And Delta her calcine, the lone medic positioned to treat casualties from what intelligence predicted would be a complex, high-intensity firefight in a confined space. She'd specifically volunteered for this assignment, requesting attachment to special operations units, despite knowing the exponentially increased danger. Officially, female medics weren't supposed to be assigned to direct combat roles, but Rodriguez had proven herself indispensable through 2 years of special operations support. Her combination of advanced trauma training, extensive combat experience, and legendary composure under fire had made her the first choice for high-risk missions, where medical expertise could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The backstory that had brought her to this mountain was written in scars and commendations. Born in El Paso to a family of police officers and EMTs, Rodriguez had enlisted straight out of high school with dreams of becoming a flight medic. Army had other plans, sending her first to Fort Sam Houston for combat medic training, then to the 75th Ranger Regiment, where she'd learned that battlefield medicine was part medical science, part improvisational art, and entirely dependent on the ability to function when everything around you was designed to kill. 10 minutes, came the whispered countdown through her earpiece. Rodriguez's heart rate increased slightly, not from fear, but from the familiar pre-combat physiological response that sharpened her senses and cleared her mind of everything except the mission ahead. She'd learned to channel that adrenaline surge, to harness it as fuel for the lightning-fast decision-making that kept soldiers alive when seconds separated life from death, and there was no second chance to get it right. Through her night vision scope, she watched the assault teams move into their final positions, like deadly choreography performed in absolute silence. The SEALs flowed across the compound's outer wall like liquid shadows, their movements coordinated. Through years of training together, and an almost telepathic understanding of each other's capabilities, the Rangers established their overwatch positions with methodical precision, their weapons trained on predetermined fields of fire that would turn every potential escape route into a killing zone. Everything was proceeding according to the meticulously rehearsed plan that had been briefed, war-gamed, and practiced until every participant could execute their role blindfolded. The intelligence was solid. The weather was cooperating. The enemy appeared unaware of the approaching assault force. Execute, execute, execute. The compound erupted in controlled violence that turned night into day. Flashbangs detonated in brilliant white flares that temporarily overloaded Rodriguez's night vision, forcing her to rely on sound and instinct. The distinctive crack thump of breaching charges echoed off the mountain walls as the SEALs simultaneously blew their way through 3 separate entry points. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. The sharp, familiar crack of American M4 carbines answered immediately by the deeper, more ominous bark of enemy AK-47 assault rifles. Rodriguez remained motionless at her position, watching through her scope and listening to the radio chatter that painted a real-time picture of the battle unfolding 300 meters below her. The initial assault phase was progressing exactly according to plan. The SEALs had achieved surprise, reached their primary objectives, and were methodically clearing rooms while maintaining tactical communication discipline. Then the mountain exploded, and everything went straight to hell. The explosion that ripped through the compound's eastern wall didn't just change the mission. It announced to every living thing within 5 miles that American Special Operations Forces had walked into a carefully prepared killing field. Rodriguez felt the shockwave hit her like a physical punch, the concussion wave rolling across her position with enough force to rattle her teeth and momentarily blur her vision. Through her night vision scope, she watched in horror as what had been a controlled tactical assault transformed into a desperate fight for survival. The blast had been massive, not the relatively small charge of an improvised explosive device, but something far more sophisticated and devastating. Intelligence later would reveal it had been a daisy-chained series of artillery shells, buried beneath the compound's floor and triggered by pressure plates that activated when the SEAL assault team reached the building's central corridor. The Taliban hadn't just been expecting an attack. They'd been preparing for this specific type of raid for months. Massive explosion in the primary target building. The radio traffic exploded into chaos as calm professional military communications disintegrated into the desperate transmissions of soldiers fighting for their lives. Multiple casualties. The entire east wall is down. We need medical up front now. Rodriguez was already moving before the transmission ended, grabbing her 40-pound aid bag and sprinting down the rocky slope toward the compound. Her training had conditioned her to respond instantly to calls for medical assistance, but what she saw through her bouncing night vision scope as she ran made her stomach clench with professional dread. The compound's eastern wall hadn't just collapsed, it had been obliterated, leaving a gaping wound in the mountainside filled with twisted rebar, concrete chunks the size of automobiles, and the ominous orange glow of fires burning deep within. The structure. Behind her, she could hear additional explosions rippling across the compound's smaller devices, designed to funnel the assault teams into predetermined killing zones where Taliban fighters waited with belt-fed machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The intelligence assessment had been catastrophically wrong. This wasn't just a planning cell operating from a fortified position. This was a sophisticated fortress designed specifically to lure American Special Operations Forces into an elaborately prepared ambush. Medic 6, what's your ETA to the casualty collection point? Major Thompson's voice cut through the radio chaos, maintaining command authority despite the disaster unfolding around his forces. 2 minutes out, Rodriguez gasped, leaping between boulders as automatic weapons fire erupted from elevated positions around the compound. Green tracer rounds, the distinctive signature of Soviet block ammunition, streaked past her position, forcing her to zigzag between cover points while maintaining her desperate sprint toward the casualties she knew were waiting. As she reached the compound's outer perimeter, the full scope of the tactical nightmare became clear. The Taliban hadn't just planted a single massive IED. They'd turned the entire compound into an interlocking series of kill zones designed to systematically destroy any assault force that penetrated their defenses. Secondary explosions continued to detonate throughout the structure, each one carefully timed to maximize casualties and create maximum psychological pressure on the surviving attackers. Through the smoke and debris, Rodriguez could see two figures stumbling out of what remained of the primary target building. Even at a distance, and through the green haze of night vision, she recognized them immediately, Navy SEALs, both moving with the distinctive gait of seriously wounded operators trying to maintain tactical mobility despite significant trauma. Petty Officer Jake Morrison emerged first, clutching his chest with both hands while blood streamed between his fingers. Even from 50 meters away, Rodriguez could see the telltale signs of a penetrating chest wound. The way he moved, the angle of his body, the increasingly desperate quality of his breathing. Without immediate medical intervention, he had minutes before tension pneumothorax or exsanguination would kill him. Chief Petty Officer David Kim limped behind Morrison, dragging his right leg and leaving a dark trail of blood across the concrete. Debris field. His movement pattern suggested major trauma to his femoral region, either arterial damage or a compound fracture that was rapidly progressing toward shock. Both men were exhibiting the 1,000-yard stare that experienced medics recognized as the first stage of severe blood loss and impending circulatory collapse. Medic! Medic! Morrison's voice barely carried over the continuing gunfire, a weak whisper that spoke to the severity of his chest trauma. A penetrating chest wound that compromised his ability to generate sufficient respiratory pressure to call for help, the kind of injury that killed elite warriors in minutes despite their legendary physical conditioning and mental toughness. Rodriguez sprinted toward them as automatic weapons fire erupted from 3 separate directions simultaneously. The Taliban had positioned machine gun nests to create overlapping fields of fire that turned the compound's main courtyard into a death trap. Red tracer rounds indicating armor-piercing ammunition cut through the darkness like deadly laser beams, forcing her to dive and roll between concrete slabs as she closed the distance to her patients. "I've got you," she said, sliding in beside Morrison with practiced efficiency. Her hands moved with a muscle memory developed through hundreds of training scenarios and dozens of real-world trauma cases. Without looking at her equipment, she located an occlusive chest seal and pressed it firmly over the sucking wound in Morrison's chest wall. The distinctive hiss of escaping air stopped immediately. First crisis stabilized, but far from resolved. Kim collapsed beside them, his face pale and clammy in the green glow of her night vision. Blood was pumping from his thigh wound in arterial spurts that indicated a severed femoral artery, a traumatic injury that could cause fatal exsanguination. In less than 5 minutes, without immediate intervention, Rodriguez applied a combat tourniquet above the wound site, twisting the windlass until the bleeding stopped completely. The radio crackled with the transmission that turned a bad tactical situation into a potential catastrophe. All elements, this is actual. Primary extraction compromised. Enemy forces have established blocking positions between current location and landing zone. Alpha, we are falling back to Rally Point Bravo. All units acknowledge and conform to movement. Over. Rodriguez looked down at her patients, both critically wounded, both requiring immediate surgical intervention that was only available at the forward surgical team located 15 miles away. She looked at the radio in her hand, knowing that Rally Point Bravo was 3 miles of hostile mountain terrain away from their current position. The main assault force was retreating. The helicopters couldn't penetrate the enemy air defense envelope to extract casualties under fire. And 2 of America's most elite warriors were dying in her hands while Taliban fighters closed in from all directions. "Chief, can you move?" Rodriguez asked Kim while maintaining pressure on Morrison's chest seal with her left hand and adjusting the tourniquet on Kim's leg with her right. Her voice carried the calm, professional tone that experienced combat medics use to project confidence even when facing impossible situations. Psychological technique, as important as any medical intervention when treating critically wounded. Soldiers who needed to believe their medic could save them. Negative. Legs. Legs pretty much done, Kim gasped through gritted teeth, his face pale and clammy with the unmistakable signs of hypovolemic shock. The shrapnel from the IED blast had done more than sever his femoral artery. It had shattered his femur and destroyed most of the muscle tissue in his upper thigh. Even with the tourniquet controlling the bleeding, Kim was looking at months of reconstructive surgery and rehabilitation, assuming he survived the next few hours. Rodriguez performed a rapid tactical assessment of their situation, while her hands continued their life-saving work. Morrison's chest seal was holding, but she could hear the distinctive wet, rattling sound that indicated blood was accumulating in his pleural cavity. Without chest tube decompression, a procedure requiring sterile conditions and equipment she didn't have, the pressure would continue building until it compressed his heart and major vessels. She had maybe 20 minutes before tension pneumothorax killed him regardless of her field treatment. Kim's tourniquet had stopped the arterial bleeding, but Rodriguez could see the telltale signs of compartment syndrome developing in his lower leg as tissue swelling increased pressure within the fascial compartments. The combination of blast trauma and prolonged tourniquet application was creating a cascade of complications that would require immediate surgical intervention to prevent permanent disability or amputation. Both men needed to be on an operating table within the next hour, not lying in the debris of an Afghan mountainside while Taliban fighters closed in on their position. "Take Morrison," Kim whispered, his voice growing weaker as blood loss and shock progressed. "Leave me. I'm done anyway." "Not happening, Chief," Rodriguez replied with the quiet authority of someone who'd made this type of decision before. Her voice carried no doubt, no hesitation, just the absolute certainty of a combat medic who'd sworn an oath to preserve life regardless of the personal cost. "We all go home. That's not negotiable. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly around them. Through her night vision scope, Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as Taliban fighters maneuvered to surround their location. The enemy had obviously planned for this scenario. Wounded Americans isolated in the compound, while their support elements retreated to defensive positions. They were being hunted by fighters who knew every inch of this terrain and had spent months preparing for exactly this type of engagement. That's when the first burst of automatic weapons fire found them. The initial volley came from their left flank, a PKM machine gun position that had been invisible until the gunner opened fire. The distinctive sound of 7.62 x 4 mmR ammunition cracking past their position was immediately recognizable to Rodriguez, who'd been on the receiving end of Soviet bloc weapons fire dozens of times during her 2 deployments. She threw herself across Morrison's chest as bullets sparked off the concrete debris around them, her body armor absorbing the impact as rock fragments peppered her exposed arms and face. The first round that hit her came from a different direction, entirely an AK-47 firing from an elevated position near the compound's northern wall. Rodriguez felt the 7.62 by 39 mm bullet punch through her left shoulder like a red-hot spike, shattering her clavicle and sending waves of burning pain down her arm. The impact spun her partially around, but her training kicked in immediately, overriding the pain response and keeping her focused on protecting her patients. Contact left, contact left. She called into her radio while returning fire with her .4 carbine, her shooting position awkward due to her wounded shoulder, but her marksmanship still deadly accurate. The distinctive crack of her 5.56 mm rounds answered the enemy fire, forcing the Taliban gunners to take cover and buying precious seconds for her to assess the tactical situation. The second burst of fire came from straight ahead, another AK-47 position that had been waiting for her to expose herself while returning fire. Rodriguez rolled right, pulling Morrison with her, when she felt something strike her ceramic body armor plates with tremendous force. 2 rounds hit her plate carrier simultaneously, the impact like being kicked by a mule and knocking the wind completely out of her lungs. The ceramic armor plates spider-webbed under the impact but held, absorbing enough energy to prevent penetration while transferring the remaining kinetic energy to her chest wall with bruising force. Rodriguez gasped for air as she struggled to maintain her position between her patients and the enemy fire. Her ribs felt like broken glass, grinding against each other with every breath, and she suspected the bullet impacts had caused at least minor internal injuries. But the plates had done their job. She was hurt but functional, still capable of fighting and providing medical care. The third burst of automatic weapons fire came from their right flank as a Taliban fighter attempted to flank their position by moving through the rubble field. This time, Rodriguez was ready, pivoting toward the threat while maintaining cover behind a concrete slab. But as she moved, a single AK-47 round grazed the outside of her right thigh, tearing through muscle tissue and drawing a line of fire down her leg. The wound wasn't immediately life-threatening, but Rodriguez could feel warm blood running down her pants leg and soaking into her boot. Combined with her shoulder wound and the blunt trauma to her chest, she was now operating with significantly degraded physical capability, while still responsible for keeping 2 critically wounded SEALs alive in the middle of an active firefight. Contact 3 shooters, requesting immediate close air support. She transmitted while applying pressure to her thigh wound with one hand and checking Morrison's chest seal with the other. Her voice remained steady and professional despite the pain and blood loss, a testament to the mental conditioning that separated elite military medics from their civilian counterparts. The response that came back over the radio chilled her to the bone. Negative on close air support. All aircraft committed to emergency extraction of main force. You are on your own, Medic 6. Good luck. Rodriguez looked down at Morrison and Kim, both drifting in and out of consciousness as their conditions continued to deteriorate. She looked at the blood seeping through her uniform from multiple wounds. She looked at the 3 miles of hostile mountain terrain between their position and the rally point where helicopters might be able to extract them. Then she made the decision that would define the rest of her life and earn her a place in military history. Using her length of 550 cord, the ubiquitous paracord that every soldier carried, and that had 1,000 uses in combat situations, Rodriguez began fashioning what she knew would either be a lifeline or a death sentence for all 3 of them. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, despite the burning pain in her shoulder and the steady throb from her thigh wound, muscle memory taking over as she rigged an improvised drag system that would have impressed her instructors at the Army. Mountain Warfare School. The system she created was a masterpiece of field expedient, engineering born from desperation and years of unconventional warfare training. She secured Morrison to her left side using a Swiss seat configuration modified for casualty evacuation. Technique she'd learned during her advanced combat lifesaver course, but had never imagined using under these circumstances. The harness distributed his weight across her hips and shoulders, keeping his injured chest elevated while allowing her to maintain some mobility. Chief Kim, semi-conscious but still capable of limited movement, she attached to her right side. With a modified rescue harness that utilized the load-bearing equipment both SEALs wore. Between both wounded operators and their essential gear weapons, ammunition, radio equipment, and medical supplies, Rodriguez was preparing to carry nearly 400 pounds of dead weight across terrain that would challenge an Olympic athlete operating at peak physical condition. "Chief, I need you to stay awake," she told Kim as she tested the improvised harness system, checking each knot and connection point with the methodical precision of someone whose life depended on the strength of every splice. "I'm going to need your help with navigation and radio communications. Can you do that for me?" Kim's response was barely a whisper, but his eyes showed the fierce determination that had made him a member of the most elite military unit in the world. "Roger, medic. I've got your back." Morrison's condition had deteriorated significantly during the time it took Rodriguez to rig the drag system. His breathing had become increasingly labored, and she could hear the wet, bubbling sound. That indicated blood was continuing to accumulate in his chest cavity despite her field treatment. The chest seal was holding, preventing air from entering the pleural space, but it couldn't address the internal bleeding that was slowly drowning him from the inside. "Rodriguez, Leave us," Morrison wheezed, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of gunfire, as Taliban fighters continued their systematic search of the compound. "Get yourself out. You've done enough." "Shut up, sailor," she replied with a grim smile that Morrison couldn't see through her night vision equipment, but could hear in her voice. "Rangers don't leave people behind. Especially not SEALs who owe me money from that poker game in Kandahar." The reference to their last meeting, a high-stakes card game in the Special Operations compound where Morrison had bluffed his way to a significant victory over Rodriguez and several other players, brought a weak laugh from the wounded SEAL. It was exactly the kind of gallows humor that kept combat soldiers functional when facing impossible odds. A psychological coping mechanism as important as any piece of medical equipment. Rodriguez knew the mathematics of what she was attempting were stacked overwhelmingly against success. 3 miles of mountainous terrain in hostile territory while carrying 2 critically wounded men. Multiple gunshot wounds affecting her own mobility and strength. No close air support, no immediate backup, and no guarantee that extraction helicopters would even be available when she reached the rally point. But the mathematics didn't account for the one factor that had defined her entire military career. Absolute, uncompromising refusal to accept defeat when American lives were at stake. The first 100 meters were the hardest. Rodriguez moved in short, tactical bounds from one piece of cover to the next, dragging both SEALs while Taliban search parties swept the area with flashlights and called out to each other in Dari and Pashto. Every 50 meters represented small victory against impossible odds. Every rock formation that provided concealment was a gift that bought them precious time and distance. Her shoulders screamed with agony every time she pulled against the harness system. The bullet had shattered her left clavicle, making her dominant arm nearly useless for heavy lifting. She compensated by using her legs and her right arm, pulling with muscles she didn't know she possessed while fighting against the increasing weakness caused by blood loss from multiple wounds. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the helplessness of listening to her patient's conditions deteriorate while being unable to provide the advanced medical care they desperately needed. Morrison's breathing became increasingly ragged as fluid continued accumulating in his chest. Kim drifted in and out of consciousness, his responses to verbal stimuli becoming weaker with each passing hour. By the time they'd covered the first mile, all three of them were operating on nothing but willpower and the kind of mental toughness that separated special operations personnel from conventional forces. Rodriguez's uniform was soaked with blood from her wounds, and she could feel the early stages of hypothermia setting in as the mountain air temperature dropped and her body struggled to maintain core temperature while dealing with significant trauma. Taliban voices echoed through the valleys around them, sometimes close enough that Rodriguez could hear individual words. The enemy search was systematic and thorough, with multiple teams working in coordination to track the American survivors. They knew the terrain intimately, had unlimited time, and possessed the numerical superiority that should have made escape impossible. What they didn't have was Rodriguez's intimate knowledge of battlefield medicine, her advanced training in unconventional warfare, and her absolute refusal to quit when her patients needed her most. As they reached the halfway point of their impossible journey, Morrison's breathing became so labored that Rodriguez knew she was looking at minutes, not hours, before respiratory failure killed him. Kim had stopped responding to verbal stimuli entirely, his body shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core organs as blood loss progressed toward the final stages of hypovolemic shock. That's when Rodriguez remembered the radio frequency that might save all their lives. The frequency for Firebase Alpha and the 155 millimeters howitzers that could reach anywhere within 15 miles of their mountain position. Firebase Alpha, Firebase Alpha, this is Medic 6, Rodriguez whispered into her radio as she crouched behind a boulder formation that provided minimal concealment from the Taliban search teams, methodically combing the mountainside. Her voice was hoarse from dehydration and blood loss, but she maintained the precise military communication protocols that could mean the difference between effective fire support and friendly fire catastrophe. The radio crackled with static for several agonizing seconds before a professional voice responded from the Fire Direction Center located 15 miles away on a fortified mountaintop. Medic 6, this is Firebase Alpha Fire Direction Center. Send your traffic. Rodriguez could hear Morrison's increasingly labored breathing beside her, each breath a wet, rattling struggle that indicated his chest cavity was continuing to fill with blood despite her field treatment. The makeshift chest seal was holding, but without surgical intervention and chest tube decompression, she was watching one of America's most elite warriors slowly drown in his own blood. Kim had been unconscious for the past 20 minutes, his pulse weak and thready, his skin cold and clammy with the unmistakable signs of severe hypovolemic shock. Firebase Alpha, I need immediate fire mission. Grid coordinates 41 Romeo-Quebec-Mike-2 34 56789. Enemy personnel in the open, approximately 15 combatants with small arms and crew-served weapons. I have 2 urgent surgical cases, and am currently moving to Rally Point Bravo under enemy contact. Through her night vision scope, Rodriguez could see the Taliban search party moving along the ridgeline above their position, their AK-47 muzzles silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The enemy fighters were using tactical flashlights to illuminate potential hiding spots, moving with the confidence of hunters who knew their prey was wounded and had nowhere to run. Their voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air Dari, and Pashto mixed with Arabic, suggesting foreign fighters had joined the local Taliban for this operation. Medic 6, confirm you are requesting danger-close artillery fire. What is your distance to target? The fire direction control officer's voice carried the professional concern of someone who understood that artillery strikes within minimum safe distances could kill friendly forces as easily as enemy combatants. Rodriguez looked at the Taliban fighters silhouetted against the skyline, then down at her dying patients. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. The enemy was close enough to detect them within minutes, but far enough away that accurate. Rifle fire would be difficult in the darkness. Artillery was their only chance, but the blast radius of 155 millimeters high explosive shells created lethal fragmentation patterns extending far beyond the official minimum safe distance. Firebase Alpha, my position is 100 meters south of target grid. I am requesting danger close fire mission with immediate suppression. Time on target, my command. The pause on the radio seemed to last forever. Rodriguez knew the fire direction officer was consulting his technical manuals, confirming that what she was requesting violated every standard operating procedure for artillery support. Danger close missions required approval from higher headquarters, additional safety precautions, and coordination with ground commanders, who could assume responsibility for friendly casualties caused by their own artillery. Medic 6, that puts you inside minimum safe distance for 155 millimeters high explosive rounds. Confirm you understand the risk and are requesting immediate fire mission. Affirmative, Firebase Alpha. I understand the risk. Rodriguez's voice carried the calm authority of someone who had calculated the odds and accepted them. Fire when ready. Rodriguez pulled both unconscious SEALs as close to the boulder formation as possible, using her own body to shield them from the anticipated artillery impact. The rock outcropping was large enough to provide some protection from the blast wave and fragmentation, but she knew that 155 millimeter shells created casualty radii that extended far beyond what most people imagined. If the fire direction calculations were off by even 50 meters, the artillery designed to save them would kill them instead. Shot over, came the radio call, indicating the artillery round had been fired and was in flight. Shot out, Rodriguez acknowledged, then pressed herself against Morrison and Kim, covering as much of their bodies as she could with her own, while keeping one eye on her watch to time the flight of the incoming shell. The 155 millimeters high explosive round arrived 37 seconds later with the sound of a freight train screaming out of hell. The explosion lit up the entire mountainside like a miniature sun, the blast wave washing over Rodriguez's position with enough force to crack the Akr boulder they were sheltering behind. Rock fragments and metal shrapnel whined overhead as the shockwave bounced off surrounding mountain faces, creating multiple echoes that sounded like the world was tearing itself apart. When Rodriguez's hearing returned, the Taliban voices had stopped. The systematic search pattern had been replaced by screams and confused shouting from the survivors of the artillery strike. She could see through her night vision scope that the ridgeline where 15 enemy fighters had been positioned now looked like the surface of the Muna, cratered landscape of displaced rock and debris where nothing moved except settling dust and smoke. Shot over, came the radio call again. Firebase Alpha, this is Medic 6. Target destroyed. Excellent shooting. I need immediate medical evacuation at Rally Point. Bravo. 2 urgent surgical cases requiring immediate transport to forward surgical team. Roger, Medic 6. Will coordinate with aviation for medical evacuation. What's your estimated time of arrival at Rally Point, Bravo? Rodriguez looked down at Morrison and Kim, both still unconscious, then calculated the remaining distance to the extraction point. 2 more miles across terrain that was marginally less hostile now that 15 Taliban fighters had been eliminated by American artillery. But she was operating on adrenaline and willpower while carrying 2 men whose combined weight exceeded her own body weight by a factor of 3. ETA approximately 2 hours, assuming no further enemy contact, she replied, knowing that estimate was optimistic under the best circumstances. What she didn't tell Firebase Alpha was that her own condition was deteriorating rapidly. The bullet wound in her shoulder had reopened during the artillery barrage, soaking her uniform with fresh blood. The graze on her thigh had become infected, causing her leg to swell and making each step increasingly painful. Most critically, she was beginning to experience the early stages of traumatic shock, the body's systemic response to massive injury, and blood loss that preceded complete circulatory collapse. But Rodriguez had made a promise, and Rangers kept their promises regardless of the personal cost. Mile 2 broke Rodriguez's body in ways that would require months of physical therapy and reconstructive surgery to repair. But it couldn't touch the iron determination that had carried her through 73 previous combat missions. The shrapnel wound in her thigh had torn open completely during the artillery barrage, creating a jagged gash that ran from her hip to her knee and left a steady trail of blood, marking their passage across the Afghan mountainside. Every step sent waves of agony up her spine, but she maintained the methodical pace that kept all 3 of them moving toward salvation. Her left shoulder had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the shattered clavicle creating a grotesque deformity visible even through her combat uniform. The bullet wound had become infected despite her attempts at field sanitation, and she could feel the distinctive heat and swelling that indicated her body was losing the battle against bacterial invasion. Without antibiotics and proper medical care, sepsis would kill her as surely as Taliban bullets, just more slowly and with more suffering. Most critically, Rodriguez was beginning to experience the early stages of traumatic shock, the body's desperate attempt to preserve core organ function when blood volume dropped below critical thresholds. Her vision was becoming increasingly tunneled, forcing her to rely more on peripheral awareness and tactical instincts developed through years of combat experience. Her hands trembled with the fine motor skill degradation that preceded complete circulatory collapse, making it increasingly difficult to monitor her patients' vital signs or adjust their medical equipment. Morrison's condition had deteriorated beyond anything Rodriguez had encountered in her medical career. His chest seal was holding, but the distinctive wet, rattling sound of his breathing indicated that blood was continuing to accumulate in his pleural cavity, despite her field treatment. Without immediate surgical intervention and chest tube decompression, she was watching tension pneumothorax slowly compress his heart and major vessels toward complete circulatory failure. His skin had taken on the gray, waxy appearance that experienced medics recognized as the final stage before respiratory arrest. Chief Kim had been unconscious for over an hour, his body shutting down non-essential functions to preserve brain and heart function as his blood pressure dropped toward levels incompatible with life. The tourniquet Rodriguez had applied to his leg was the only thing preventing immediate exsanguination, but she knew that prolonged tourniquet application was creating its own cascade of complications. Tissue death, compartment syndrome, and systemic toxicity from dying muscle tissue would require amputation even if they reached medical care in time. As dawn approached over the Hindu Kush Mountains, Rodriguez faced the most difficult decision of her military career. Continue moving in daylight and risk detection by Taliban search teams, or find concealment and watch both of her patients die while she waited for darkness. The tactical manual said to hide during daylight hours when enemy forces controlled the terrain. Her medical training said that Morrison had minutes, not hours, before his injuries became incompatible with life. She chose to move. The decision violated every principle of small unit tactics she'd learned during Ranger training. But Rodriguez had moved beyond tactical doctrine into the realm of pure desperation, guided by medical necessity. Morrison needed a surgeon's hands within the next 60 minutes, and that meant accepting the exponentially increased risk of daylight movement through hostile territory. Firebase Alpha, Medic 6, she called as Taliban voices began echoing from the valley behind them, the distinctive sound of organized pursuit by fighters who had picked up their blood trail and were closing the distance with systematic efficiency. I need another fire mission. Medic 6, send your grid coordinates and target description. The fire direction officer's voice carried the professional calm of someone who had processed dozens of similar requests throughout the long Afghan night. But Rodriguez could hear the underlying concern for the lone American medic, who kept calling for artillery support from impossible positions. Grid coordinates 41 Romeo-Quebec-Mike-238874643. Approximately 15 to 20 personnel in pursuit formation. Small arms and crew-served weapons. They're following my blood trail and closing fast. Rodriguez's voice was becoming increasingly hoarse from dehydration and the physical strain of calling for artillery support while dragging two critically wounded men across mountainous terrain. She estimated the Taliban pursuit team was less than 30 minutes behind them, moving faster than her group could travel while burdened with casualties and medical equipment. This time, the artillery response came without the lengthy safety discussions that had characterized their previous fire missions. Medic 6, shot over. Shot out. Rodriguez pulled both SEALs into the shadow of a rock outcropping and covered them with her own body as 155mm shells screamed overhead toward the Taliban pursuit team. The explosions echoed through the valley behind them, followed by the blessed silence that indicated another successful artillery strike against enemy forces. But Rodriguez knew this was likely her final fire mission. Her radio batteries were showing critical low power indicators, and the constant transmission requests were draining the remaining charge faster than the solar panel attachment could replenish it. Firebase Alpha had been providing artillery support throughout the night, but their ammunition supply wasn't unlimited, and other American units across the province were calling for fire support as Taliban forces launched coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm coalition defensive positions. As the sun climbed higher above the mountain peaks, she could see Rally Point Bravo in the distance, a flat area marked by infrared strobes visible only through night vision devices, where helicopters could land and extract casualties back to the forward surgical team. The extraction point looked impossibly close and infinitely far away simultaneously, a tactical illusion created by the combination of blood loss, physical exhaustion, and the distorted perspective that came from viewing terrain through optical equipment while operating at the limits of human endurance. So close she could almost taste the metallic tang of rotowash and jet fuel. So close she could visualize the flight medics who would take over care of Morrison and Kim, providing the advanced life support that her field medical kit couldn't deliver. So close that she allowed herself to believe, for just a moment, that all three of them might actually survive this nightmare. That's when she heard the distinctive whop-whop of approaching helicopters, the sound every combat soldier recognized as salvation arriving from the sky. Two UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters appeared over the eastern ridge like mechanical angels, flying low and fast in a tactical formation that announced the arrival of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers, who specialized in impossible extractions from hostile territory. Rodriguez felt a surge of hope that momentarily overrode the waves of pain and exhaustion, threatening to drag her into unconsciousness. The distinctive sound of twin General Electric turboshaft engines meant salvation was minutes away for Morrison. And Kim, she activated her infrared strobe beacon with trembling fingers, a device automatically cycling through the identification pattern that would mark their position for the incoming aircraft. Through her fading night vision, the batteries in her equipment were as depleted as everything else after the night-long ordeal. She could see the helicopter's door gunners scanning the terrain through their own optical systems, searching for threats while the pilots maneuvered toward the designated landing zone. Rodriguez began dragging her patients toward the flat area that constituted Rally Point Bravo, summoning reserves of strength she didn't know she still possessed. Morrison had stopped responding to verbal stimuli entirely, his breathing so shallow and irregular that she had to check for a pulse every few minutes to confirm he was still alive. The chest seal was holding, but she could see the telltale cyanosis around his lips that indicated inadequate oxygenation. His body was shutting down from the combination of blood loss and respiratory compromise. Chief Kim remained unconscious, his pulse weak and thready beneath her fingers when she checked his carotid artery. The tourniquet on his leg had been in place for over 4 hours, well beyond the recommended maximum application time. Even if they reached surgical care immediately, Kim was looking at months of reconstructive surgery and possible amputation. But he was alive, and in combat medicine, alive was the only victory that mattered. The helicopters were less than half a mile from the landing zone when the Taliban launched their final desperate assault. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked across the valley like deadly comets, their characteristic whoosh-crack signature announcing that enemy forces had positioned themselves in the high ground surrounding the extraction point. The Taliban commanders had anticipated exactly this scenario, wounded Americans calling for helicopter extraction to a predetermined landing zone that could be pre-targeted with heavy weapons and crew-served machine guns, taking RPG fire. Taking RPG fire. The lead pilot's voice crackled over the radio as his aircraft maneuvered violently to avoid the incoming rockets. LZ is hot. Cannot approach with this level of ground fire. Rodriguez watched in horror as green tracer rounds, the distinctive signature of Soviet bloc ammunition, began streaming from multiple positions around Rally Point Bravo. The Taliban had established interlocking fields of fire that turned the flat landing area into a killing zone designed to destroy any helicopter that attempted to land. PKM machine guns, RPK squad automatic weapons, and individual AK-47 rifles created a deadly light show that made helicopter insertion tactically impossible. The door gunners on both Black Hawks returned fire immediately, their M134 miniguns laying down suppressive fire at cyclic rates that consumed ammunition at 4,000 rounds per minute. The distinctive buzzsaw sound of the electric Gatling guns dominated the battlefield acoustics as streams of 7.62 millimeters NATO rounds impacted enemy positions with devastating effect. But the Taliban fighters were deeply entrenched in prepared positions, and there were too many of them spread across too wide an area for the door gunners to suppress effectively. Medic 6, we cannot get in with this much ground fire. The lead pilot's voice carried the frustration of someone who wanted desperately to extract the wounded Americans, but couldn't risk his aircraft and crew in a suicide mission. We need that LZ cleared before we can attempt landing. Rodriguez looked at Morrison, whose breathing had become almost imperceptible. She looked at Kim, whose skin had taken on the gray pallor that indicated impending circulatory collapse. She looked at the Taliban muzzle flashes winking from positions all around the landing zone, and she made the decision that would either save all their lives or end them in the next few minutes. Her radio had enough battery power for one final transmission to Firebase Alpha, one last call for artillery support that would either clear the landing zone or kill everyone within a quarter-mile radius, including herself and her patients. Firebase Alpha, Medic 6, she called, her voice hoarse and barely audible over the sound of gunfire. I need immediate fire mission. Grid coordinates 41 Romeo-Quebec-Mike-2456780. Multiple enemy positions surrounding. Rally Point Bravo. Danger. Close. Immediate suppression required for helicopter extraction. The response came back immediately. The fire direction officer's voice tight with concern. Medic 6, confirm your grid coordinates. That fire mission puts high explosive rounds directly on your extraction point. Rodriguez pulled both unconscious SEALs against the largest boulder she could find, a granite outcropping that might, possibly, provide enough protection from the artillery barrage she was about to call down on their own position. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. 155 millimeters high explosive shells would create lethal fragmentation patterns extending in all directions from the impact points. If the fire direction calculations were off by even 20 meters, American artillery would complete what the Taliban had started. But Morrison was dying in her arms, and Kim had maybe minutes before irreversible shock killed him. The helicopters couldn't land with the LZ under fire, and she didn't have the strength to drag both men to an alternate extraction point, even if one existed. Firebase Alpha, I understand the risk, Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the absolute calm of someone who had accepted the consequences of an impossible decision. My position is 50 meters southeast of target grid. Fire for effect. She positioned herself between the boulder and her patients, using her own body as additional shielding, while she waited for the shells that would either save them or end their suffering with merciful efficiency. Shot over, came the radio call, indicating multiple artillery rounds were in flight toward their position. Rodriguez pressed her face against Morrison's chest, listening to his failing heartbeat, while 155 millimeters shells screamed overhead toward the Taliban positions that surrounded them on all sides. The artillery barrage that followed was biblical in its intensity and surgical in its precision. 6 155 millimeters high explosive shells impacted around Rally Point Bravo in a coordinated time-on-target mission that transformed the Taliban ambush positions into a moonscape of displaced earth and twisted metal. The concussion waves bounced off the surrounding mountain faces like thunder, creating multiple echoes that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Hindu Kush Mountains. Rodriguez felt the earth beneath her convulse with each impact, rock, fragments and metal shrapnel whining overhead as she maintained her position, shielding Morrison and Kim with her own body. The boulder that had seemed so substantial moments before cracked under the repeated shockwaves, spiderweb fractures spreading across its surface as the mountain itself absorbed the tremendous kinetic energy of American artillery. When the guns fell silent and the smoke began to clear, the tactical situation had been transformed completely. The interlocking fields of machine gun fire that had made helicopter landing impossible had been replaced by smoldering craters and an ominous silence that indicated the Taliban ambush had been neutralized with devastating effectiveness. Black Hawks swept in immediately, their pilots demonstrating the kind of precision flying that had made the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment legendary throughout the special operations community. The lead aircraft touched down exactly in the center of Rally Point Bravo, while the second bird maintained overwatch, its door gunners scanning for any surviving enemy fighters who might still pose a threat to the extraction. I've got them. I've got them. Rodriguez called to the flight medics as they jumped out of the helicopter, their medical equipment already prepared for the trauma cases they were expecting. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from dehydration and weakened by blood loss. But it carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had kept two critically wounded warriors alive through an impossible ordeal. Morrison's got attention. Pneumothorax, sealed and decompressed with chest seal, but he needs immediate surgical decompression. She briefed the flight medics with the precise terminology that would save precious seconds in the trauma bay. Kim's got a severed femoral artery, tourniqueted for over 4 hours. Needs immediate vascular surgery and possible amputation. Both patients have been in shock for multiple hours. Rodriguez collapsed as the flight crew took over care of her. Patience, her body finally surrendering to the massive trauma and blood loss that she had been fighting through sheer willpower for the past 8 hours. Her last conscious image was of Morrison and Kim being loaded onto stretchers with 4 lines and cardiac monitors already attached. The flight medics working with the same calm efficiency that had kept her functional throughout the nightmare ordeal. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood at attention in the White House East Room, surrounded by the kind of political and military leadership that most soldiers only saw on television. Her dress blue uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and decoration positioned with mathematical precision, but she still favored her left shoulder slightly, a permanent reminder of the night she had redefined the meaning of heroism under fire. President Obama held the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration, as he spoke words that would be remembered long after the politics of the Afghan war had faded into history. The courage displayed by staff. Sergeant Rodriguez represents the finest traditions of the United States Army and the warrior ethos that defines our Special Operations Forces. Under sustained enemy fire, wounded herself, she carried her fellow warriors to safety while calling in artillery strikes that saved not only her own life, but the lives of her patients and the aircrew who rescued them. The citation continued, with clinical precision that couldn't capture the human drama of that night. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's actions resulted in the successful extraction of 2 critically wounded Special Operations personnel from hostile territory, demonstrating extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for her own safety in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. Chief Petty Officer David Kim stood in the audience, his leg fully healed after 3 surgeries and months of physical therapy that had restored full mobility. The doctors had initially recommended amputation, but advances in vascular surgery. And Kim's own determination had saved his limb and his career. He would return to operational status with SEAL Team 6 within the year. Beside him, Petty Officer Jake Morrison breathed easily, his chest fully recovered from the trauma that should have killed him on that Afghan mountainside. The surgical team at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center had performed a miracle of battlefield medicine, but they all acknowledged that Rodriguez's field treatment had been the difference between life and death during those critical first hours. After the ceremony, as photographers captured images for the historical record and politicians made speeches about American valor, Morrison approached Rodriguez with the familiar grin that had sustained them both during their darkest moments in the Hindu Kush. "I believe I owe you some money from that poker game in Kandahar," he said, his voice carrying the easy camaraderie that existed between warriors who had shared the ultimate test of combat. Rodriguez laughed, the first genuine, unguarded laugh she'd experienced since returning from Afghanistan. The sound surprised her with its normalcy, a reminder that life continued beyond the mountains, where she had discovered the absolute limits of human endurance and the true meaning of military service. "Keep it, sailor," she replied, with the same mock rivalry that had characterized their friendship. "Buy me a beer instead. But make it a good one. I've developed expensive tastes since becoming a national hero." "Deal. But first." Morrison's expression grew serious, his eyes bright with emotions that most Special Operations personnel kept carefully controlled. "Thank you for not leaving us behind when every rational thought told you to save yourself." Rodriguez looked around the East Room at the assembled military leadership, cabinet members, and media representatives who had come to witness her moment of recognition. None of them truly understood what had happened on that mountain, the impossible choices, the moments when death seemed inevitable, the simple decision to keep moving forward when every fiber of her being screamed to quit and accept defeat. "Rangers don't leave people behind," she said with the quiet conviction that had defined her entire military career. "That's not who we are. That's not who America is." 3 years later, Command Sergeant Major Maria Rodriguez became the first woman to lead a special operations medical unit, her promotion part of a broader transformation in military policy that recognized competence and courage as gender-neutral virtues. Her actions in Afghanistan had influenced congressional testimony, changed training protocols, and opened doors for women in combat roles throughout the Department of Defense. But on that day, in the White House, surrounded by the two men she had carried to safety and the nation's leadership, she remained simply a soldier who had done her job when it mattered most.